What Edgar Cayce revealed about Christ's cosmic power was not a vague metaphor, not a poetic invention, but a documented reality that came through in his trance sessions. Imagine this. During the height of the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were living in despair, a man in Virginia Beach would lie down on a couch, close his eyes, enter a self-induced sleep, and begin to speak words that no one expected. In one of his most striking sessions of 1932, Cayce described Jesus not only as a historical figure, but as the living channel of a universal force that transcended human comprehension. He explained that Christ represented the ultimate vibration of creation itself, the same energy that formed galaxies, stars, and the consciousness of humankind. This was not a religious sermon. It was a radical revelation. And here is where most people are shocked. Cayce said that this cosmic Christ power was not locked away in heaven, but available within every soul who chose to awaken it. What does this mean? That the very energy that kept the universe alive could also heal a sick body, transform a broken mind, and realign a lost life. During another session that changed the life of an entire family, Cayce explained that through prayer aligned with Christ's vibration, diseases that doctors had declared irreversible could be reversed. What happened next left even skeptics speechless. The man known as the sleeping prophet spoke with precision. He didn't use grand theology or speculation. He spoke of forces he claimed were as real as gravity. When asked about Jesus, Cayce often paused, breathing deeply, and then explained that Christ's cosmic power was the pattern of the human soul before it became entangled in material illusions. He said that to live in harmony with that force meant returning to the original blueprint of creation. Imagine being in that room. A family torn apart by illness, worry, and economic collapse listened as Cayce, with closed eyes and steady voice, described a healing process that didn't start with medicine, but with aligning one's mind and heart to the same vibration Christ carried. He called it the Christ pattern. And here's what nobody expected. Those who followed the recommendations, whether it was prayer, meditation, or specific lifestyle adjustments, often saw results doctors could not explain. A woman once bedridden began walking again. A child who suffered chronic seizures began to recover. Skeptics argued coincidence, but the documented reports filed in the Association for Research and Enlightenment archives still exist to this day. These weren't isolated miracles, they were repeated patterns, and in every one of them Cayce pointed back not to himself, but to the living presence of Christ's cosmic power available to anyone willing to connect. But let's not forget the context. These revelations didn't come in an era of comfort. They came when America was in deep pain. The 1930s were marked by hunger, unemployment, and uncertainty about the future. People needed answers, and churches were not enough for everyone. In Virginia Beach, people would travel from distant states just to sit in a small room where Edgar Cayce slept and spoke truths that shook their core beliefs. He said, "Christ is not a figure of 2,000 years ago. Christ is the living power within you now." That was a sentence that froze the air. Imagine being told that the same energy that created stars was available in your own prayers, your own thoughts, your own acts of love. This wasn't philosophy, it was instruction. Cayce described how meditation could tune the mind to higher frequencies, where the Christ force could heal, guide, and uplift. He explained that every thought carried vibration, and those who aligned with the higher vibration of Christ naturally attracted strength, health, and wisdom. And when people doubted, he gave evidence. He diagnosed illnesses without seeing the patients, describing organs, conditions, and treatments that were later confirmed by physicians. His accuracy was so consistent that even doctors had to admit there was something extraordinary happening. And always, Cayce credited this ability to the Christ consciousness. Not his own mind, but the universal mind accessible through alignment with Christ's power. Pause here and think. If this is true, if Cayce was not imagining but tapping into a real force, then the implications are staggering. It means that healing is not only a matter of medicine, but of vibration. It means that transformation is not limited to therapy, but to tuning into a universal current that Christ himself embodied. And Cayce made it clear. Jesus was not an exception to humanity, but the example of humanity. His power was not exclusive. It was the destiny of every soul. The Christ force, according to Cayce, is the divine pattern imprinted in all of us, waiting to be awakened. The problem is that most people live disconnected, trapped in fear, selfishness, and material illusions. But when a person chooses faith, love, and service, they begin to resonate with that higher pattern. And this is where the unimaginable happens. Bodies begin to heal, minds begin to find peace, lives begin to transform. This was not abstract spirituality, it was applied truth. And families across America, from Kentucky to Ohio, testified that their lives were never the same after encountering Cayce's sessions. One doctor who attended said, "What I saw defies medical logic, but I cannot deny the results." What Cayce revealed was not about converting people to a religion. It was about reminding them that they were already connected to the greatest power the universe had ever known. During the years of war, when young men were being sent overseas and families feared receiving telegrams with the worst news imaginable, Edgar Cayce continued to speak about Christ's cosmic power as the only real anchor of peace. Imagine this setting: a dimly lit room in Virginia Beach. A group of anxious parents gathered while Cayce entered his self-induced trance. Their questions were about life and death, about sons on distant battlefields, about whether survival was even possible in a world torn apart. And in that fragile silence, Cayce revealed something astonishing. He said that Christ's vibration was not limited by distance, that a prayer spoken in Virginia Beach could reach a soldier in France or the Pacific. He explained that consciousness itself was not bound by geography or time, but woven together through the Christ pattern that united all souls. What happened next was recorded. Families who followed his guidance, praying not in desperation, but in alignment with Christ's power, reported strange coincidences. Letters from their sons described miraculous escapes, close calls where they felt a sudden calm just before danger, as if a shield of light had protected them. Skeptics called it chance. But for the families who had felt helpless, this was no coincidence. This was proof that Christ's force, revealed through Cayce's words, could intervene in ways science could not explain. But here is the part that truly unsettled both theologians and scientists of his time. Cayce insisted that this was not magic, not blind superstition, but the natural law of vibration. Just as radio waves transmit messages through invisible currents, Christ's cosmic energy transmits life and protection through higher frequencies of thought and spirit. He even compared prayer to tuning a radio. If the dial is off, the signal is static, but when the mind aligns with the Christ frequency, the channel becomes clear and powerful. He emphasized that the difference between an unanswered prayer and a miraculous one was not about God refusing or granting, but about whether the person was truly aligned with the Christ force within, and this changed everything for those listening. They realized that prayer was not begging, it was tuning. Meditation was not escape, it was alignment. Service to others was not optional, it was resonance with the same law that Christ embodied. And slowly, families across America began to practice these principles, not just in churches but in their daily lives. Some created prayer groups that still exist today, inspired directly by Cayce's teachings, built on the belief that collective minds aligned in Christ's vibration could heal and uplift entire communities. Now let's step back into the historical frame. During the post-war years, America was entering a new era of prosperity, but also of existential searching. Material comfort returned, but people began asking deeper questions about meaning, about consciousness, about whether life was more than work and consumption. This is where Cayce's revelations became prophetic. He explained that Christ's cosmic power was not just about healing illness or surviving war, it was about the evolution of the soul. He said that humanity stood at a crossroads, that every generation would be tested on whether it would live in harmony with that divine vibration or continue down the path of division and materialism. And here's the shocking statement. Cayce declared that civilizations of the past, including Atlantean cultures, had collapsed not because of external forces, but because they failed to live according to the Christ pattern. Their technology and knowledge outpaced their spiritual alignment, and the result was destruction. He warned that modern civilization faced the same risk. That sentence echoed with urgency. The Christ force is the law of balance in the universe. To ignore it is to invite collapse. To live by it is to ensure survival, not only of individuals, but of nations. And yet, Cayce was not a prophet of doom. His words carried an unmistakable hope. He told people that awakening to Christ's cosmic power was possible for anyone, young, old, rich, poor, educated, uneducated. He said that the key was not in believing the right doctrine, but in living the right vibration. That meant practicing forgiveness even when it hurt. That meant choosing compassion when anger was easier. That meant daily aligning thought, prayer, and action with the Christ ideal. And over, documented testimonies showed that when people did this, lives changed. A businessman who had lost everything in the Depression rebuilt his life not by chasing profit, but by serving others in honesty and fairness. A mother who had lived in bitterness after losing a child found new joy by dedicating herself to prayer and acts of kindness. A young man addicted to alcohol slowly recovered by practicing Cayce's methods of meditation and Christ-centered living. These were not abstract examples. They were recorded stories preserved in the archives, and they continue to inspire seekers today. And this brings us to the deeper point. Cayce was not simply talking about Jesus as a figure of history. He was revealing the cosmic Christ as a force that still lives and moves within the fabric of reality. As the 1950s unfolded, Cayce's earlier words began to resonate even more strongly with those searching for answers beyond material progress. The United States was entering a new phase of modernity, suburbs expanding, television becoming a household presence, consumer culture booming. But beneath the surface, many felt an emptiness. In this context, the idea that Christ's cosmic power was a living force accessible to every individual struck a deeper chord. People began to realize that material comfort did not erase spiritual hunger, and Cayce had already pointed to this hunger years before, saying that the human soul would never be satisfied with things alone, because its true nourishment came from aligning with the eternal vibration of Christ. He warned that the coming decades would present humanity with temptations of distraction, false security, and shallow pursuits, but only those who remembered the Christ force within would find lasting peace. Imagine the contrast. Shiny new cars, endless advertisements, promises of happiness through products, and then the quiet, steady reminder that true fulfillment was already within, waiting to be awakened through prayer, meditation, and selfless service. What made Cayce different from preachers and philosophers of his time was the sheer weight of evidence. Families recorded the words, followed the instructions, and saw transformations unfold. Skeptics documented cases thinking they would disprove him, only to find that the results were undeniable. In one session that shocked even doctors present, Cayce described the internal organs of a man he had never met, explaining both the condition and the treatment. Later examinations confirmed the accuracy, and the man's health improved after following the guidance. But Cayce insisted again and again, this was not his power. It was Christ's cosmic force flowing through the channel of human alignment. He was only a conduit, and anyone who attuned themselves could experience the same miracles. This idea unsettled traditional institutions because it suggested that divine power was not mediated only by churches or hierarchies, but directly available to every soul. And yet, it was precisely this democratization of spiritual access that gave so many ordinary Americans hope. Let's step into the 1960s, a time of cultural upheaval, civil rights movements, protests, and a hunger for new spiritual identities. Even though Cayce had passed away in 1945, his words lived on through the ARE and the thousands of readings preserved. In that decade, seekers of all kinds, students, activists, philosophers, found in his work a bridge between ancient spirituality and modern consciousness. The idea that Christ's power was cosmic, not confined to one religion or one era, resonated with a generation that was questioning everything. Cayce's message fit perfectly. Christ was not a distant savior locked in history, but the living vibration of divine order, accessible to anyone willing to align with it. This is what made his teachings timeless. While others debated dogma, Cayce pointed people to practice. meditate daily, pray with sincerity, forgive even the deepest wounds, and live in service. And when people applied these practices, they discovered something astonishing. The same sense of presence and guidance Cayce had described decades earlier. But here's where the narrative becomes even more powerful. Cayce explained that Christ's cosmic energy was not only about healing individuals, but guiding the evolution of humanity itself. He said that every soul carried memories of past lives, that every challenge was an opportunity to grow closer to the Christ ideal, and that the ultimate destiny of humanity was to embody that power fully. He described the human journey as a return to oneness, a movement from separation and ignorance back to harmony with the source. And here's the sentence that echoes like thunder across the decades. The Christ Spirit is the pattern for all souls. That means Jesus was not meant to be worshipped as an unattainable figure, but followed as a model. His miracles were not exceptions, but demonstrations of what aligned consciousness could do. This was Cayce's radical gift, reframing Christ not as unreachable divinity, but as the universal template for what it means to be fully human. For a world still grappling with war, inequality, and division, this teaching was nothing less than revolutionary. As we move deeper into Cayce's legacy, one theme becomes clear. Christ's cosmic power was not abstract theory, but a living energy that touched every area of life, body, mind, and spirit. In one of his sessions during the early 1930s, a family approached him desperate for help with a child who had been suffering seizures since infancy. Traditional doctors had exhausted every option. Lying in trance, Cayce spoke calmly and said the seizures were connected not only to physical imbalances, but to vibrations in the child's nervous system that could be realigned through spiritual practices, diet, and daily prayer centered on the Christ pattern. The parents followed his instructions. Weeks later, the frequency of seizures decreased. Months later, the child's health showed undeniable improvement. What stunned the family was not only the healing itself, but Cayce's insistence that the real source of recovery was the Christ force moving through them. Not his words, not medical intervention alone, but the universal vibration of love and order that Christ embodied. This was not about creating dependence on Cayce, it was about awakening the divine connection within every soul, and that became the defining feature of his message. He consistently directed people away from worshipping him and toward practicing alignment with the Christ ideal. He would say, "Do not make an idol of any man. Look instead to the pattern of the Master." To Cayce, Jesus was not simply a savior who erased sins, but the living demonstration of what humanity could become when fully attuned to divine vibration. In multiple readings, he emphasized that Jesus was the perfect example, showing humanity the way back to its original design. And he made a bold claim that startled many, that each soul had the potential to manifest the same creative and healing forces if it chose to walk in harmony with the Christ Spirit. This turned spirituality from passive belief into active practice. It meant that healing, wisdom, and transformation were not miracles reserved for saints, but possibilities written into the blueprint of every human being. This leads to a question many asked. If Christ's cosmic power is within everyone, why don't we see miracles everywhere? Cayce's answer was simple, yet profound: alignment. He said that most people lived out of tune, trapped in fear, selfishness, and material distractions. Just as a radio cannot play music if it is set to the wrong frequency, a soul cannot manifest divine power if it resonates with doubt, hate, or greed. The path to awakening Christ's force, therefore, required deliberate choices: daily meditation, prayer, forgiveness, compassion, and service. These were not moral rules imposed from outside, but the natural conditions that tuned the soul to higher frequencies. When a person chose forgiveness over resentment, they stepped closer to alignment. When they chose service instead of selfishness, they vibrated in harmony with the Christ pattern. And in those moments, extraordinary things became possible. Families testified to impossible healings. Soldiers spoke of divine protection in war. Individuals discovered inner peace despite unbearable circumstances. Each story pointed back to the same truth. Christ's cosmic power was real, and it worked through those who aligned with it. The broader implication of Cayce's message was staggering. It suggested that human consciousness itself was the frontier where the greatest battles were fought. Wars, diseases, poverty, these were not only external problems, but reflections of inner disconnection from the Christ force. If enough individuals chose alignment, Cayce said, entire societies could transform. He even warned that the future of nations depended on their willingness to live by the Christ ideal of love and unity. Otherwise, like civilizations of the past, they would collapse under the weight of their own imbalance. This was not mere prophecy of doom, it was a call to responsibility. Every act of forgiveness, every prayer spoken with sincerity, every choice to serve rather than exploit, was a contribution to the survival and evolution of humanity. Seen through this lens, Christ's cosmic power was not only a path for individuals, but the hope for civilization itself. And that is why his words remain so relevant today, in an age still plagued by conflict, division, and the illusion that material power alone can save us. As we follow Cayce's words into the later decades of his life, the vision of Christ's cosmic power became even more expansive. He spoke of it not only as a force for healing individuals or guiding nations, but as the very pattern through which the universe itself operates. During one of his documented sessions in Virginia Beach, he explained that the laws of physics, the rhythms of nature, and the cycles of human consciousness were all reflections of the Christ vibration. To him, Christ was not only a teacher in history, but the living blueprint of creation itself. This is why he called Jesus the pattern man, not to diminish his divinity, but to emphasize that what Christ demonstrated was the universal design of every soul. This revelation challenged both religion and science. For theologians, it meant Christ's role was larger than any church had taught. For scientists, it suggested that consciousness and cosmic order were inseparably linked. And for ordinary people, it was both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it revealed how far humanity had strayed from the pattern, empowering because it showed the way back was always within reach. This perspective also transformed the way people approached suffering. In multiple readings, Cayce explained that pain and difficulty were not punishments from God, but opportunities to realign with the Christ force. He gave the example of illness. Instead of seeing it as a curse, he urged individuals to see it as a signal, a reminder that something in body, mind, or spirit had drifted out of harmony. When addressed with prayer, meditation, and right action, suffering became the gateway to transformation. This idea was revolutionary for families who had felt crushed by despair. A woman battling chronic illness came to Cayce for guidance. In trance, he described her condition with precision and then explained how aligning her thoughts with forgiveness, combined with specific natural remedies, could restore her balance. Months later, she returned with renewed health. For her, the healing was physical, but the deeper transformation was spiritual. She no longer saw herself as a victim of fate, but as a soul rediscovering its alignment with the Christ vibration. This shift, from despair to empowerment, was the real miracle. Cayce's insistence on the practical nature of Christ's cosmic power is what continues to make his teachings timeless. He didn't present Christ as unreachable, existing only in ancient texts or distant heavens. He described Christ as the living vibration that anyone could touch in the stillness of meditation, in the sincerity of prayer, in the choice to forgive, and in the act of loving others without condition. He taught that the Christ Spirit was the true self of every soul, the essence waiting beneath layers of fear and ego, and he often used the language of resonance to explain it. Just as one tuning fork can cause another to vibrate when they are attuned, so too does Christ's vibration awaken the same pattern in us when we open ourselves. That meant every act of kindness was more than moral, it was cosmic alignment. Every prayer lifted in faith was more than hope, it was real contact with the universal force. And every moment of love was a spark of the same energy that created galaxies. This was Cayce's message, that Christ's cosmic power is not far away but within, waiting to be lived. The implications for the future were profound. Cayce warned that humanity's greatest test would come not from outside threats, but from whether it could live in harmony with the Christ pattern. He spoke of coming challenges, economic upheavals, social unrest, even earth changes, but always tied them to the spiritual condition of humanity. He explained that collective misalignment with divine law would manifest as chaos in the world, but collective alignment could bring a new era of peace. He even suggested that America's destiny as a nation was tied to whether it embraced service, compassion, and unity over selfishness and greed. For those listening, this was not just mystical speculation, it was a call to action. It meant that the choices of individuals mattered not only for their own lives, but for the survival and direction of the entire planet. And at the center of it all was the Christ vibration, the cosmic power that Cayce said was both the origin and the destiny of every soul. As Cayce's words echo into our present time, their urgency becomes impossible to ignore. He explained that Christ's cosmic power was not meant to remain hidden in archives or reserved for spiritual elites. It was meant to guide humanity into a new age of awakening. One of his most striking insights was that the evolution of the soul was not an abstract journey to some distant heaven, but a daily choice to embody the Christ vibration here and now. He often said that every thought is a seed, every act a vibration, and together they form the fabric of reality. This meant that the wars, conflicts, and divisions we see in the world are not just accidents of history, but reflections of collective consciousness failing to align with the Christ pattern. Conversely, every act of forgiveness, compassion, and truth-telling contributes to shifting the entire frequency of humanity. Imagine the implication. One person choosing love over hate does not just change their life. It becomes part of the invisible current shaping the future of the planet. Cayce also tied this cosmic principle directly to the mysteries of reincarnation and the soul's journey through time. He explained that each lifetime is an opportunity to come closer to alignment with Christ's vibration. Mistakes and failures are not final, they are lessons. Illnesses are not random, they are reminders. Relationships, even painful ones, are not accidents. They are chosen arenas where the soul learns love, patience, and forgiveness. And the ultimate goal of all these experiences is to awaken the divine pattern within, until the soul fully resonates with Christ. In this way, Christ's power was not only the energy of creation, but the destiny toward which all creation moves. That means every soul, no matter how lost, no matter how burdened, is already marked with this eternal blueprint. Cayce's message was clear. You are not seeking God outside. You are rediscovering the Christ within. That sentence alone had the power to change lives, because it shifted the focus from external searching to internal awakening. Perhaps the most compelling aspect of Cayce's revelations was their practicality. He did not leave people with lofty ideals without application. He gave step-by-step instructions. Meditate daily, even for 10 minutes, to quiet the mind and tune into higher vibrations. Pray with intention, not as begging, but as aligning with divine will. Practice forgiveness, even when the wound feels too deep, because holding on to resentment blocks the flow of Christ's force. Serve others, not out of obligation, but out of recognition that the Christ vibration flows strongest through love in action. And finally, guard your thoughts, because every thought resonates as energy. For those who applied these disciplines, life began to shift in ways they could not explain. They felt calmer in the face of crises. They recovered from illnesses that once seemed hopeless. They discovered clarity in making decisions that once paralyzed them. These were not coincidences. They were demonstrations of the Christ pattern awakening in daily life. So what does this mean for us today? It means that Christ's cosmic power, as revealed through Edgar Cayce, is not simply a theological idea, but a living force calling each of us to participate. The same energy that healed in the past, that guided soldiers in war, that restored broken families in the Depression, is still available now. And in a world drowning in noise, conflict, and division, Cayce's voice reminds us of a higher frequency, one that can heal the body, transform the mind, and unite humanity. The question is not whether the power exists, it does. The question is whether we will align ourselves with it. Will we live in fear, anger, and selfishness, or will we choose forgiveness, service, and love? The future of our lives, our communities, and even our world depends on that choice. Because as Cayce revealed again and again, the Christ vibration is the eternal law of creation, and those who align with it discover not only healing and peace, but the true destiny of the soul. And now, if this revelation touched your spirit, I invite you to reflect on how you can apply it today. Take a moment to think of one act of forgiveness you can practice, one moment of service you can offer, one prayer you can lift with sincerity. These small steps are not small at all. They are ways of tuning your life to the Christ pattern. And if you want to continue exploring the mysteries Edgar Cayce revealed, stay connected here. There are more insights, more testimonies, and more wisdom waiting to be uncovered together. Join this community, subscribe, share your thoughts, and let's walk this path of awakening as one. Because what Cayce showed us is not just history, it is the living invitation of Christ's cosmic power waiting within us right now. In one of his most striking readings from the early 1930s, Edgar Cayce was asked a question that startled even those accustomed to his remarkable insights. What truly happened during the unknown years of Jesus' adolescence? Most of us are familiar with the story of his birth, and we know about his ministry that began in his 30s. But what about the silent years in between? In that quiet period, spanning nearly 2 decades, the Bible offers little detail, leaving room for speculation and mystery. Cayce, in trance, touched on this hidden phase, offering glimpses that many describe as both reverent and transformative. Before we unfold this profound revelation, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who is curious about the life of Jesus, and subscribe to our channel. Comment what you think about this mystery. I'll heart every comment because your perspective matters in building this community. Cayce's words were not dramatic inventions, but careful impressions, often delivered while he rested on a couch in Virginia Beach or during earlier years in Hopkinsville. Those present were ordinary families, seekers, sometimes medical doctors, and spiritual leaders looking for answers. In one life-changing session, during the Great Depression, a family desperate for spiritual guidance asked about the missing years of Jesus. The reading did not come with theatrics or theatrics of prophecy. It came gently, with language simple enough for anyone in the room to understand. Cayce described a youth who was far more than a carpenter's son. He was a soul preparing for a mission that would change humanity forever. According to these readings, adolescence was not wasted in idleness. It was a time of learning, traveling, and quietly building the strength of character required for the path ahead. Historical context matters here. During those years, regions like Galilee and Judea were under Roman occupation, and life was not easy for Jewish families. Opportunities were scarce, and poverty was widespread. To speak of a boy growing up in such a climate, preparing for a mission of compassion and universal love, carried a powerful message to those listening in Cayce's time. It was the early 20th century, an era scarred by world wars and economic collapse. And yet Cayce spoke of a hidden hope, that Jesus himself endured a formative period that resembled the struggles of every human adolescent. It made him relatable, human, and approachable, while still being divinely guided. This duality, fully human and fully divine, was what Cayce illuminated with humility and reverence. One striking statement he made was that Jesus traveled beyond his home region during those years, encountering wisdom traditions that broadened his awareness. Cayce mentioned lands where spiritual practices had long been cultivated, places where healing and meditation were central. Though skeptics dismissed these accounts as speculation, those who had followed Cayce's work saw continuity in his descriptions. He was not inventing folklore. He was channeling information consistent with his lifetime of readings on reincarnation, soul journeys, and the preparation of the Messiah. What startled listeners was not simply where Jesus may have traveled, but how universal his mission became in adolescence. He absorbed knowledge that transcended cultural and religious barriers, preparing him to later deliver teachings of love, forgiveness, and unity that applied to all people, not just one group. During one session in Virginia Beach, Cayce explained that these formative years were essential to what later became known as Christ consciousness. He described adolescence as the period when the young Jesus was not only physically maturing, but also awakening to the vast memory of the soul. In Cayce's perspective, Each of us carries within us records from past lives, what he called the Akashic records. For Jesus, these records were not blurred or hidden. They unfolded naturally as he grew, shaping his awareness that he was destined for something extraordinary. Imagine being a teenager and slowly realizing that your purpose was to embody divine love for the entire world. Cayce suggested that this realization came not as a sudden lightning bolt, but as a steady light growing brighter with each year. That picture made listeners lean closer because it humanized what many thought was untouchable mystery. Skeptics often asked, but how could Cayce know such things? This was not blind imagination. From the early 1900s, thousands of people had documented Cayce's readings, carefully transcribed, archived, and studied by the Association for Research and Enlightenment. In these documents, one finds recurring details that connect across different sessions. Cayce consistently portrayed Jesus as a youth deeply committed to preparation, discipline, and compassion. One family that sought guidance during the dark years of World War II heard Cayce say that understanding Jesus' adolescence could inspire young men and women facing fear, loss, and uncertainty. If the Messiah himself endured a path of silence, growth, and struggle before stepping into his mission, then perhaps every young person's pain or confusion held hidden meaning too. The emphasis was never on exotic legends, but on spiritual application. Cayce explained that the lessons Jesus absorbed in adolescence were not just for him, they were archetypal for humanity. He spoke of disciplines of the body, mind, and spirit that mirror what modern seekers recognize as meditation, prayer, and service to others. These practices, Cayce said, became the scaffolding of Jesus' public ministry. They were the silent years where the foundation was laid. He compared them to the unseen roots of a tree, invisible but essential, hidden yet sustaining the greatness that would one day be revealed. When audiences in the 1930s and 40s heard this, it gave them courage. If the unseen years of struggle could produce such fruit, then perhaps their own hidden struggles were preparing them for a larger purpose. One particularly moving detail Cayce shared was about the harmony between Jesus and his earthly family. Though he faced the same tensions any adolescent might, there was a deep respect and sense of mission within the household. Cayce reminded listeners that Jesus was not isolated in a supernatural bubble. He lived among people, worked with his hands, and knew the taste of sweat and labor. This made his later message of compassion real, not abstract. When he spoke of the poor, he had lived their life. When he spoke of healing, he had witnessed suffering firsthand. The adolescent years, Cayce emphasized, were the bridge between heaven and earth, teaching Jesus how to walk in both realms at once. And that revelation, that the Messiah's power was forged in ordinary human experiences, shook the hearts of those who came to Cayce looking for hope. Cayce went further, explaining that adolescence was not a period of waiting, but of active training. He described Jesus studying with teachers who carried fragments of wisdom from ancient traditions, remnants of knowledge stretching back to Egypt, Persia, and lands of the East. While Cayce avoided sensationalism, he consistently pointed to a universal thread, that Jesus, as a young man, absorbed truths beyond the narrow borders of his homeland. This was not to diminish his divinity, but to show that his mission was inclusive, destined to reach every culture and every soul. According to Cayce, these encounters were less about doctrines and more about practices, healing methods, meditation, fasting, and the balance of body and spirit. When read in context, these insights drew a powerful image of a youth preparing in silence, gathering tools that would later be seen in his miracles, parables, and teachings of unconditional love. In one documented case during the Great Depression, a small group gathered in Virginia Beach with heavy questions on their hearts. They asked Cayce about the unseen years of Jesus, seeking comfort for their own families torn by poverty and fear. Cayce's response gave them perspective. He reminded them that even the Christ child endured years of obscurity before his mission began. He worked, studied, and grew in strength and wisdom. This message became deeply relevant to those struggling. If Jesus' hidden years were necessary for his divine purpose, then perhaps their own hidden struggles carried meaning too. That revelation transformed despair into patience, urging them to see their trials as preparation rather than punishment. For many, that night was unforgettable, because it connected their pain with the larger story of humanity's greatest teacher. Cayce's emphasis was always on application. He did not describe the adolescence of Jesus to satisfy curiosity or stir debate. Instead, he framed it as a model for human growth. Adolescence, he said, is the time when each soul begins to remember its deeper calling. For Jesus, that calling unfolded clearly. For us, it emerges in smaller ways, through intuition, through struggles, through the search for meaning. Cayce urged listeners not to idolize the mystery, but to reflect. How are you preparing in your own silent years? What lessons are you gathering in times when no one is watching? This was the genius of his teaching. He connected the most mysterious period of Christ's life to the very ordinary struggles of those listening in his day, whether in Kentucky, Virginia, or anywhere across America. And then came one of the most startling statements. Cayce said that during these years, Jesus not only learned but healed. Imagine that, a young man, still unknown to the world, already practicing the compassion that would later define his ministry. The stories of these healings were not recorded in the Gospels, but Cayce insisted they occurred in quiet, in small communities, witnessed by a few. These acts were not about fame or recognition. They were training, practice, and service. They revealed that even before the public miracles, the power of divine love was already flowing through him. When this was shared in the 1940s, listeners felt chills. It was not fiction, not legend. It was a glimpse into a sacred truth that Cayce delivered with humility, insisting it was not his own knowledge, but information accessed through the infinite mind of God. As these readings circulated, many began to see Jesus' adolescence not as a missing puzzle piece, but as a deliberate silence meant to teach us something profound. Cayce explained that the absence of detail in Scripture was itself a lesson. Growth happens in hidden seasons, away from the spotlight. Just as a seed germinates underground before breaking through the soil, Jesus' preparation unfolded quietly, far from public recognition. This perspective resonated deeply in America during times of hardship. Families in Virginia Beach and beyond, reeling from war and economic despair, found hope in the idea that their own invisible struggles might be part of a divine design. It was a reminder that obscurity is not abandonment. It can be sacred preparation. Cayce's words carried the weight of empathy, delivered not with dogma, but with the tenderness of someone who truly understood human pain and divine possibility. Another layer of these revelations was the universality of Jesus' mission. Cayce stressed that adolescence was when the young Christ absorbed the essence of different traditions and wove them into a unified understanding of God's love. He was never bound by cultural walls. The wisdom of healing, the practice of prayer, the discipline of silence, all became threads in a larger tapestry that pointed humanity back to its source. This was not speculation. It was consistent across multiple readings. People who attended these sessions noted how seamlessly Cayce returned to this theme, that adolescence was the period of integration, where knowledge from many paths crystallized into the message that would later shake the foundations of the world. For modern audiences, this is powerful because it reveals Jesus not as distant, but as deeply connected to the whole human family. Cayce also reminded listeners that adolescence is universally difficult. It is a time of identity, conflict, and search for meaning. By showing that even Jesus walked through that valley, Cayce gave hope to young people who felt lost. He spoke during an era when American youth were being drafted into wars, when families were fractured, and when many questioned the future. Cayce's message was clear. If the Messiah himself had to walk silently through confusion, temptation, and growth, then your struggle is not meaningless. It may be shaping your destiny. This teaching touched hearts not just in churches, but in living rooms, farms, and hospitals, wherever people longed to believe their pain had purpose. It reframed adolescence as sacred ground, where the soul remembers who it truly is. And then, in one of the most profound moments recorded in his readings, Cayce said that during these hidden years, Jesus consciously chose humility. He could have revealed his identity early. He could have astonished crowds with miracles as a boy. But he didn't. According to Cayce, the choice to remain hidden was itself the miracle. It showed that true power does not seek attention. It prepares in silence until the right moment. This struck listeners as a divine paradox. The most extraordinary being in history chose an ordinary life for nearly 20 years. That choice revealed a love so patient, so disciplined, that it became the ultimate preparation for his public ministry. For those who heard this in the 1930s and 40s, it was more than history. It was a call to patience, faith, and trust in divine timing. Modern scholars at the Association for Research and Enlightenment often point out that Cayce never sensationalized these hidden years. Instead, he presented them as a model of spiritual formation that applies to everyone. Adolescence, in Cayce's view, is the time when the soul begins to remember its eternal purpose, though often in subtle, confusing ways. By highlighting Jesus' adolescence, Cayce reminded seekers that even the greatest teacher in history had to walk through the same valley of growth, self-discovery, and discipline. This perspective stripped away the idea that spiritual greatness arrives fully formed. Instead, it affirmed that transformation is a process, and that hidden years matter just as much as public ones. For the people listening in Virginia Beach, especially during the uncertainty of the post-war years, this was deeply comforting. It told them their quiet struggles at home, unseen by the world, still carried eternal meaning. Cayce's revelations also reshaped how many understood Christ consciousness. He described Jesus' adolescence as the period when this awareness became clearer, an unfolding recognition that he was not separate from God, but one with divine love. This idea was not abstract philosophy. It was grounded in lived experience, work, travel, study, and quiet service. For Cayce, Christ consciousness was not reserved only for Jesus. It was a potential within every human being. Adolescence, with all its confusion and searching, could become the threshold where people awakened to that truth. To the families who came seeking answers, this message was both radical and deeply practical. It suggested that their children's struggles, their own doubts, and their hidden battles were not failures but invitations to remember their spiritual identity. Some of the most moving stories from those years involve individuals who left Cayce's sessions with renewed strength. One man, burdened with fear during World War II, later said that hearing Cayce speak of Jesus' silent preparation gave him the courage to face his own unknown future. A mother from Ohio grieving the loss of a son wrote that Cayce's description of the young Christ reminded her that God's timing often hides its purpose until much later. These testimonies, preserved in the archives of the ARE, reveal how profoundly these readings touched ordinary lives. They were not meant to be intellectual curiosities. They were lifelines for people living through some of history's darkest times. And still, the mystery remains. The Bible remains silent on these years, and Cayce's readings do not claim to fill every gap. Instead, they offer a lens, a perspective that turns silence into sacred instruction. By embracing the unknown years as purposeful, we are invited to reconsider our own seasons of obscurity. Maybe the times when nothing seems to be happening are when the deepest preparation is taking place. Cayce's message echoes through generations. What seems hidden is not wasted, and what feels like delay may be divine timing. As he once said, the soul grows most in the silence. And for those reflecting on Jesus' adolescence, that truth is not just historical, it is personal. Today, seekers across the world still revisit Cayce's descriptions of the hidden years of Jesus as a guide for their own spiritual practice. The readings consistently linked the adolescence of Christ with disciplines we can all apply. Prayer as a daily anchor, meditation as a doorway to divine connection, and service as the highest form of learning. Cayce explained that these practices, cultivated quietly during Jesus' youth, later became the foundation of his public ministry. They were not just religious duties, but transformative tools. For instance, when Cayce spoke about the value of silent meditation, he pointed back to the adolescent Christ, who withdrew often into quiet spaces to commune with the Father. To modern audiences, this lesson remains powerful. Your inner life, though unseen, shapes the destiny of your outer life. The message is timeless, reminding us that what we build in silence eventually becomes visible in our actions and relationships. The influence of these teachings reaches beyond church walls. In Virginia Beach, lectures at the ARE still emphasize how Cayce portrayed Jesus' adolescence as a model of balance, body, mind, and spirit in harmony. Physical work, such as carpentry or labor alongside his family, was not separate from spiritual growth, but part of it. Cayce insisted that spirituality is not confined to temples or altars. It is lived in daily choices, chores, and encounters with others. This was revolutionary for listeners in the 1930s, who often thought holiness belonged only to priests or sacred rituals. By framing Jesus' hidden years as a time of ordinary labor infused with divine purpose, Cayce helped everyday people see their own work as sacred. Even washing dishes, tending fields, or repairing tools could become training for the soul when done with awareness of God's presence. These insights have also influenced modern approaches to adolescence itself. Psychologists and spiritual teachers inspired by Cayce note that the teenage years are when identity is formed and choices begin to define character. By pointing to Jesus' adolescence as a season of integration, Cayce encouraged parents to treat this stage not as rebellion to be feared, but as preparation to be supported. He reassured families that confusion is natural and that even the greatest soul to walk the earth faced seasons of uncertainty. This perspective transformed fear into patience, helping parents guide their children with compassion rather than control. In countless ARE gatherings across decades, this teaching has been repeated. Adolescence is not the problem, it is the pathway. One of Cayce's most repeated phrases during these readings was that the pattern was set. By this, he meant that the adolescence of Jesus established the rhythm and foundation that his later ministry would follow. Healing the sick, forgiving enemies, teaching love, these were not random acts. They were the natural outflow of years of hidden discipline, silent study, and humble service. This truth continues to inspire spiritual communities who study Cayce today. They see in Jesus' adolescence not just a mystery resolved, but a challenge issued. Are we preparing in our hidden years? Are we laying a foundation of prayer, compassion, and humility that will sustain us when our public moments arrive? For many, this has become the heartbeat of their spiritual journey, guided by Cayce's reverent words. One of the most striking moments in the archives comes from a session in the early 1940s, when a small circle asked Cayce directly about the wisdom Jesus carried as a young man. In a calm voice, while in trance, Cayce said, "He knew from youth that his work was to fulfill the law of love, yet he chose to walk the path of every man." This statement stunned those in the room. It revealed that adolescence was not a time of ignorance, but of conscious humility. Jesus was aware of his mission, yet he accepted the ordinary struggles of youth, growth, work, responsibility, without demanding recognition. For listeners, the weight of those words was unforgettable. It meant that the Son of God chose to experience the human journey fully, so he could speak to humanity with genuine compassion. Many present described tears filling their eyes because it reframed their understanding of divinity. Power revealed not in avoiding human life, but in embracing it. Another unforgettable phrase emerged in a reading requested by a family coping with illness during the Great Depression. They asked how to remain faithful when so little made sense. Cayce responded by drawing a parallel to Jesus' hidden years, saying, "Even the Master waited, even the Christ child endured seasons unseen. Your waiting is not wasted." Those words became a lifeline. In an age of despair, the thought that waiting could be sacred transformed lives. To this day, that phrase circulates in study groups and sermons across ARE circles, reminding seekers that the silence of God may in fact be the deepest preparation of all. It was not poetry for effect. It was spiritual truth, spoken with the authority of one whose readings had guided thousands through crises. Cayce also gave glimpses into the disciplines of healing that Jesus practiced even as a youth. In one session, he explained that the laying on of hands and the use of prayer for physical renewal were not techniques Jesus suddenly discovered in adulthood. They were skills refined quietly in adolescence. Imagine a teenage boy offering comfort to the sick, not for recognition but out of pure compassion. For those listening, this revelation was almost too moving to describe. It was as if a veil had been lifted, showing that divine love had always been present, quietly training itself in the shadows of daily life. And yet, Cayce was careful to avoid exaggeration. He reminded listeners that these stories were not for entertainment, but for transformation. What he did, you may do also if you keep the law of love. The emotional intensity of these readings left a permanent mark on many who heard them. People wrote letters to the ARE, saying that for the first time they could picture Jesus not as a distant figure on stained glass windows, but as someone who had walked through the very struggles they faced. Adolescence, once seen as an empty gap in Scripture, became a bridge of empathy. This was Cayce's gift, not to fill silence with speculation, but to show that silence itself can speak louder than words. In the mystery of Jesus' adolescence, he revealed a pattern of hidden growth, patient waiting, and silent preparation that continues to guide seekers nearly a century later. As we move toward the heart of Cayce's message, it becomes clear that the mysterious adolescence of Jesus was never meant to remain a blank page in history. Instead, it serves as a mirror for our own hidden years, those seasons when nothing seems to move forward, when prayers feel unanswered, when our efforts go unseen. Cayce's voice echoed through decades, insisting that these seasons are not empty, they are preparation. Just as Jesus used adolescence to cultivate wisdom, discipline, and compassion, so too are we invited to see our struggles as sacred training grounds. This truth remains timeless, and for many who listened to Cayce in Virginia Beach or studied his archived readings later, it was the single most liberating perspective they had ever heard. What felt like delay became destiny. What seemed like silence became the soil of transformation. The implications for modern seekers are profound. If the Christ himself endured a period of obscurity, then our own hidden struggles are not disqualifications, but confirmations that something larger may be at work. Cayce's accounts remind us that preparation often looks like ordinary life, working, serving, learning, and waiting. He urged people to trust divine timing, assuring them that nothing surrendered in love is ever wasted. When applied today, this lesson can change how we approach our own lives. The frustrations of adolescence, the monotony of work, the uncertainty of waiting, they may all be echoes of the same pattern Jesus lived. For audiences today, this message still carries weight, reminding us that the greatest transformations often happen far from the public eye. And so when we reflect on the mysterious adolescence of Jesus, as revealed by Cayce, we are not asked to fill in the silence with legends. We are asked to embrace the silence itself as holy. This is why Cayce's words remain relevant across generations. They lift the burden of needing to see immediate results and replace it with trust in a divine process. For the youth searching for identity, for the parent guiding their children, for the seeker waiting in prayer, the message is the same. The hidden years matter. They are the years where character is forged, faith is deepened, and destiny is quietly prepared. Jesus walked that path, and through Cayce's insights we are reminded that we walk it too. If this journey through Cayce's revelations has touched you, I invite you to pause and reflect. What hidden season are you living right now? Could it be that the silence is shaping you for something greater? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll mark each one with a little heart because your reflections build a community of seekers walking this path together. And don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next exploration into the mysteries of spirit, history, and consciousness. Together, we continue to uncover the truths that Cayce so humbly revealed, truths that still whisper through the silence of Jesus' adolescence, guiding us all toward deeper love and higher purpose. In one of his most impactful readings of 1932, Edgar Cayce said something that startled those present. Jesus was not only the Christ, but also the perfect example of how every soul is meant to embody the Christ consciousness. Imagine the shock of hearing those words in a time when most churches taught that Jesus was entirely separate from humanity. Cayce wasn't denying Jesus' divinity, he was revealing the hidden link that few dared to acknowledge. The Christ is both the eternal Spirit of God and the destiny planted in every soul. To Cayce, Jesus demonstrated that union fully, but he also came to show us that the same awareness waits within each of us. This was a revelation that comforted those who had lost hope during the Great Depression and challenged religious leaders who wanted to keep the Christ as an unreachable figure. Cayce insisted that the real message of Jesus was not worship me, but follow me, and you will discover the same light. And that link between Jesus and the Christ consciousness is what he believed would one day transform the world. Before we go deeper, let me ask, what would change in your life if you truly believed that the same divine awareness that lived in Jesus is waiting to awaken in you? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because this conversation is meant for the entire world. Cayce explained this hidden link again and again during sessions that transformed people's lives. In Virginia Beach, families came seeking healing for illnesses, guidance in crises, and hope in despair. And time after time, Cayce connected their struggles to the same truth. The Christ consciousness is the answer, and Jesus is the model. He taught that prayer is how we align our hearts with God, meditation is how we listen to the inner voice, forgiveness is how we dissolve barriers, and service is how we make the divine real in the world. Each of these steps mirrors the way Jesus lived, and that is why Cayce said Jesus is the pattern, the living map of our spiritual evolution. He described the Christ consciousness as the universal awareness of oneness with God, and Jesus as the one who reached that state completely. This does not diminish Jesus' role, instead it magnifies it, because it means his life is not a distant story, but a mirror held up to our own souls. But here is what nobody expected. Cayce revealed that the Christ consciousness existed long before Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. He described it as the eternal Spirit of God moving through creation, guiding humanity across ages. Jesus, in his words, was the full and perfect embodiment of that Spirit in human form. That means the Christ is not confined to one moment in history. It is a living presence that continues to call each soul forward. For Cayce, this was the missing key that connected faith to destiny. He said that Jesus' mission was not only to redeem, but to reveal, to show us that we, too, carry the Christ pattern within. This teaching was radical because it shifted the focus from believing in Jesus alone to following his example and awakening the same awareness. It transformed the way people saw their purpose. No longer was life just about survival, wealth, or comfort. The true goal, according to Cayce, was to awaken the Christ within and live it out daily just as Jesus did. This discovery challenged both science and religion of his time. Scientists dismissed Cayce as uneducated and unqualified, while many religious leaders saw his words as dangerous. Yet the people who sat with him in Hopkinsville or Virginia Beach testified that his readings changed their lives in ways no sermon ever had. He described illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, gave guidance that brought peace in impossible situations, and always pointed back to the same truth. The Christ consciousness is real, and Jesus is the perfect link to it. And what happened next defied all logic. As people applied these teachings, meditating, forgiving, serving, they reported not only inner peace but also physical healings and reconciled relationships. For them, the Christ consciousness was not theory. It was powerfully alive. And Cayce reminded them that this was exactly what Jesus promised when he said, "You will do even greater things than I have done." When Cayce spoke about the hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness, he often emphasized that Jesus was the first to fully embody the pattern, but not the last. He explained that Christ is the eternal awareness of oneness with God, while Jesus was the man who perfectly manifested that awareness in the world. In one of his sessions during the 1930s, Cayce shocked listeners when he said, "The Christ is universal, but Jesus became the perfect channel for it." For many, this broke open a new way of thinking. It meant that Jesus was not distant, unreachable, or meant only to be worshipped. He was the living model of what is possible for all humanity. Cayce urged people to look at the way Jesus lived, his compassion, his forgiveness, his service, his courage, and to understand that these were not just acts of divinity, but demonstrations of what awakened humanity looks like. This was the link. Jesus embodied the Christ fully so that we could see the path and follow it. But here's where it becomes even more extraordinary. Cayce taught that this link explains why Jesus' words and actions carried such timeless power. He said that when Jesus forgave, healed, and loved unconditionally, he was not operating from human strength, but from Christ consciousness flowing through him. And he told seekers that the same flow is available to them when they align themselves with God through prayer, meditation, and service. This was not meant as poetic inspiration, it was meant as practical truth. During the Second World War, when people came to Cayce in despair, he often reminded them that the presence of Christ is not limited by time or space. He said that by awakening to that presence within, they could find peace even when the world outside was in chaos. And many testified later that they experienced exactly that. An inner calm that could not be shaken, even while bombs were falling and loved ones were missing. Still, Cayce was careful to point out that awakening the Christ consciousness is not automatic. He said that while every soul carries the spark, it can remain hidden under layers of selfishness, fear, and material obsession. Jesus, he explained, was the one who showed us how to remove those barriers completely. By forgiving his enemies, serving without seeking reward, and remaining faithful even in suffering, Jesus demonstrated the practices that strip away the ego and reveal the Christ within. This is why Cayce insisted that Jesus is not only Savior, but teacher, the one who not only redeems but instructs us in how to live. In this sense, the hidden link is not just theological, but deeply practical. Jesus is both the proof and the path of Christ consciousness. And for those who listened to Cayce, this realization changed everything. Suddenly, faith was no longer about waiting for heaven after death, but about living heaven here and now through awakened awareness. What happened next surprised even the skeptics. People who began applying Cayce's guidance, meditating daily, forgiving old grudges, serving others quietly, reported not only inner peace but also external transformation. Relationships healed, health improved, and new opportunities opened. Cayce explained that this is the natural result of living in Christ consciousness. When we align with divine love, life itself begins to realign around us. He compared it to tuning an instrument. When the soul is tuned to the Christ, the music of life becomes harmonious, and he warned that when we refuse this tuning, discord grows. Nations fight, families divide, and individuals fall into despair. The hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness, then, was not meant as a theological curiosity. It was a call to live differently, to embody love so fully that the world itself is changed. For those who heard it, this was more than comforting words. It was a revelation that gave purpose and direction to their lives. Cayce also connected this hidden link to the soul's eternal journey. He explained that each soul carries the Christ pattern within. But through lifetimes of choices, experiences, and struggles, that awareness becomes clouded. Jesus, he said, was the one who cleared away every shadow, embodying the pattern perfectly. And in doing so, Jesus became the bridge that shows all souls the way back to God. This insight was radical in its time. In the 1930s and 40s, when most sermons emphasized human unworthiness, Cayce was declaring human potential. He wasn't denying sin or weakness. He acknowledged them as real obstacles, but he insisted that within each soul was the same light that guided Jesus. The hidden link, then, was this: Jesus is not separate from humanity, but the ultimate expression of what humanity can become. For listeners struggling with guilt or despair, this message was liberating. It told them that their lives had meaning far beyond survival or success. Their true destiny was to awaken the Christ within. One of the most powerful aspects of this teaching was how it transformed suffering. Cayce reminded people that Jesus faced pain, betrayal, and death itself, yet he responded with forgiveness and love. This, he explained, was Christ consciousness in action, the ability to see beyond the immediate wound and remain aligned with God. And he told seekers that they too could transform suffering if they chose to respond with love. In one session that deeply moved a family, Cayce said that their hardships were not punishments, but opportunities to awaken. By holding to faith and practicing forgiveness, they could turn pain into power. This reframing gave people a sense of purpose, even in their darkest hours. During the war years, when loss touched almost every home, this teaching gave families a way to endure. They could see their suffering not as meaningless chaos, but as part of the soul's path toward awakening the same awareness Jesus lived. But here's what nobody expected. Cayce said that this link between Jesus and Christ consciousness was also the key to humanity's future. He explained that if individuals awakened to this awareness, society itself would change. Wars, divisions, and injustices, he warned, are symptoms of forgetting the Christ within. When nations act from fear and greed, they invite destruction. But when people begin to live from Christ consciousness, through forgiveness, service, and love, those same forces of destruction lose their power. He even suggested that global peace would only come when enough individuals lived as Jesus lived, embodying the Christ fully in their daily lives. This was a staggering claim because it placed responsibility not on governments or institutions, but on ordinary souls. Each act of love, each choice for forgiveness, each moment of meditation, he said, contributes to a larger awakening that can transform the world. Cayce also confronted the objections directly. Many asked him, "Doesn't this teaching make Jesus just another man?" His answer was always clear: no, it makes him the greatest man because he fulfilled the divine destiny perfectly. Cayce insisted that Jesus was unique, not because he had a privilege we lack, but because he completed the journey we are all called to walk. In this way, Jesus' greatness becomes even more profound, because it shows us not only what God can do, but what humanity can become when united with God. The hidden link is that Jesus is both our Savior and our example, the one who shows us that salvation is not just believing in him, but becoming like him. This was Cayce's boldest claim, and it is why his words still provoke both resistance and inspiration today. For those willing to listen, it unlocks a new vision of faith, one that is not passive, but transformative. Cayce often used simple but profound metaphors to describe this hidden link. He would say that Jesus was like the perfect lens through which the light of Christ shone without distortion. The Christ, he explained, is eternal and universal. But in most of us, the light bends, scatters and weakens as it passes through the fog of selfishness, fear and doubt. In Jesus, the lens was clear. Every action, every word, every thought aligned perfectly with God. That is why Jesus could say, "I and the Father are one." Cayce wanted people to understand that this was not an unreachable state, but the model for humanity's true destiny. The task of life, then, is to polish our lens through prayer, meditation, forgiveness, and service, until the Christ shines as brightly in us as it did in him. And this vision changed everything. It shifted faith from worshipping at a distance to living as participants in the same divine reality. For those who heard it, this was not just theology, it was an invitation to transformation. He also pointed out that Jesus himself taught this truth. In one reading, Cayce reminded listeners of the moment when Jesus said to his followers, "You are the light of the world." This, he explained, was not poetry or encouragement, it was literal truth. Jesus was declaring that the same light he embodied also dwelled in them. The hidden link was always there in Scripture, but Cayce's readings brought it into focus, in a way people could not ignore, and what followed was extraordinary. Men and women who began living with this awareness reported that their lives changed in dramatic ways. Anxiety gave way to peace, illnesses improved, families reconciled. Cayce explained that these were not miracles in the sense of breaking natural law. They were the natural results of aligning with the deepest law of all, the law of love. Jesus lived it perfectly, and Cayce urged everyone else to begin living it step by step. But here is where Cayce introduced another powerful idea. He said that the Christ consciousness is not only personal, but cosmic. It connects us not only to God, but to every other soul. When Jesus embodied the Christ fully, he became the bridge not only between humanity and God, but also between humanity and itself. This is why, Cayce explained, Jesus prayed for unity, that they may all be one as you, Father, are in me and I in you. For Cayce, this was the hidden link revealed. Jesus was the demonstration that all souls are already connected through Christ, and until humanity awakens to this truth, division and conflict will continue. But once awakened, we will discover that we are not isolated beings, but expressions of one divine reality. This vision is as urgent today as it was in Cayce's time. It calls us not only to personal awakening, but to collective transformation. Cayce also emphasized that this hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness gives meaning to the soul's struggles across lifetimes. He explained that each incarnation is an opportunity to remove the obstacles that block the light of Christ within us. Mistakes are not final condemnations, but lessons that, when understood, bring us closer to the pattern Jesus demonstrated. He often told seekers that they had lived before, and that the challenges they faced in the present were connected to unresolved lessons from the past. In one session that shocked a family, he revealed that their constant conflicts were echoes of choices made in earlier lives, and that forgiveness in the present could break the cycle. This teaching was revolutionary because it showed that Christ consciousness is not only about one lifetime, but about the soul's eternal journey. Jesus then was not only Redeemer, but also way-shower across ages, proving that no matter how many times we fall, the Christ within us calls us back to God. For people weighed down with guilt or regret, this message opened a door of hope that nothing else could. He also connected this link to the destiny of nations. Cayce explained that just as individuals carry the Christ within, so do societies reflect or ignore this awareness. When nations act in fear, greed, or violence, they block the Christ pattern and bring destruction on themselves. But when they act in service, compassion, and cooperation, they reflect the same love Jesus embodied. This was not theory for Cayce. He warned repeatedly during the war years that humanity's survival depended on whether it chose to live by Christ consciousness. He said the hidden link between Jesus and this awareness was the key to peace. Not treaties, weapons, or power, but a collective awakening to the divine within. His words were a challenge to leaders and citizens alike, reminding them that the path to a new world lay not in conquest but in love. For many, this shifted how they saw their role in society. They realized that their personal awakening was part of a much larger plan for humanity. And yet, Cayce always brought the teaching back to the practical level. He reminded people that awakening the Christ within is not about dramatic revelations or mystical visions. It is about daily choices. He urged seekers to begin every morning in prayer, to meditate regularly, to forgive those who had wronged them, and to serve wherever they could. These were the tools Jesus used, and they remain the path for us. The hidden link is revealed in action, not theory. Cayce explained that every time we choose love instead of fear, every time we place another's needs before our own, every time we open our hearts in prayer, we awaken more fully to the same awareness Jesus embodied. He warned that without these daily practices, the Christ within remains dormant, but with them, it grows stronger until it transforms not only the individual, but everyone around them. This is how, Cayce said, the world itself will one day be renewed. In the final years of his life, Cayce spoke with even greater urgency about this hidden link. He insisted that humanity stood at a crossroads, and that the only true hope for the future was for enough souls to awaken to the Christ consciousness that Jesus revealed. He explained that technology, politics, and wealth could never solve the deepest problems of the world because they operate only on the surface. The real transformation must come from within, from the recognition that the same divine light that lived fully in Jesus is alive in each of us. He told seekers that the more they lived in alignment with this truth, the more they would see healing in their families, peace in their communities, and even balance in the natural world. The Christ consciousness, Cayce said, is not an idea to admire but a power to embody. And Jesus remains the eternal reminder that it can and must be done. For many who studied his readings, this changed everything. They began to see their spiritual lives not as a duty to appease God, but as an opportunity to become like Christ. They discovered that Jesus' promise, the kingdom of God, is within. Yuma was not metaphor but reality. Cayce showed them that the hidden link between Jesus and Christ consciousness is the key to understanding who we are, why we are here, and what we are meant to become. And this realization brought courage, because it meant no one is left out. No matter your past, your background, or your struggles, the Christ pattern is in you, waiting to awaken. Jesus embodied it perfectly, but he also opened the door for you to follow. That is the link. Jesus is not only the one who showed the Edgar Cayce, he is the way. And so we are left with a question that Cayce asked again and again. What will you do with the Christ consciousness within you? Will you let it remain hidden under fear and selfishness, or will you awaken it through prayer, meditation, forgiveness, and service? The answer is not only about your life, it is about the future of humanity. Because Cayce believed that the fate of the world rests not in governments or armies, but in awakened souls who live as Jesus lived. If this message has stirred something in you, share it now, join this community, and commit yourself to living the Christ pattern. For as Cayce reminded us, it is not what we believe that transforms the world. It is what we live. Jesus lived, the Christ fully. The hidden link is that we are called to do the same. Imagine being in Virginia Beach in the 1930s, walking into a modest room where a man lay down, closed his eyes, and entered a trance. Those present weren't expecting theology, they were desperate for answers. And then Cayce, in one of his most impactful readings of 1932, declared that the Christ consciousness was not a distant mystery reserved for saints, but a living force already within every soul. This was shocking, because at a time when religion often focused on sin and punishment, Cayce was pointing to something transformative. Awakening the Christ within could heal bodies, restore families, and guide lives. He made it clear that Jesus was the perfect example of this awareness, but not the only one called to embody it. The Christ, Cayce said, is the pattern for every soul. Think about the weight of those words. If true, it means you already carry within you the same light that guided Jesus, and that your life's real purpose is to awaken it. Before we continue, I want you to pause and consider, how different would your choices be if you lived every day knowing that the Christ consciousness was already inside you? If this question moves something in you, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, so we can see how far this message is spreading. Cayce explained that awakening the Christ consciousness was not about following dogma, but about living principles that align us with God. He gave practical steps again and again. Start each day with prayer to set your mind toward divine purpose. Enter into meditation to quiet the ego and hear the voice within. Practice forgiveness even when it feels impossible, and serve others selflessly. These weren't abstract ideas. They were concrete disciplines he offered to people facing unbearable circumstances. During one session that changed a family's entire life, a mother worried about her sick child was told that while medical care was important, the most powerful healing came from aligning with the Christ within, expressing love, faith, and peace in the home environment. The family later testified that this shift in consciousness transformed not only the child's recovery, but their entire household. This is what Cayce meant by awakening. It is not a sudden miracle that falls from the sky, but the steady cultivation of divine awareness in daily choices. And he insisted this path was available to anyone, rich or poor, educated or uneducated, Christian or not. But here's what nobody expected. Cayce made it clear that the Christ consciousness is blocked, not by lack of religion, but by selfishness, fear, and material obsession. He warned that when we let greed or anger control us, we create barriers inside ourselves that hide the light of God. Awakening, therefore, is not about adding something new, but removing the obstacles that already cover the divine spark within. He urged people to examine their thoughts, because every thought creates an impact. Loving thoughts expand the Christ consciousness, selfish thoughts shrink it. In wartime sessions, when families begged him for hope as their sons fought overseas, Cayce reminded them that through prayer and meditation, they could extend love that would reach beyond distance, creating a field of protection. For some, this was more than comfort. It became proof, as many later described moments when their loved ones felt unexpected peace in the middle of battle. This was Cayce's bold claim. The Christ consciousness is not theoretical, it is powerfully real and it acts when we align with it. And yet, Cayce also gave a warning that still matters today. He said the Christ consciousness is humanity's true destiny, but if we ignore it, we invite chaos and destruction. He foresaw divisions, wars, and suffering if enough people failed to awaken, but he never spoke with despair. His message was always one of hope, because he believed that even a small group of awakened souls could shift the future of an entire nation. He saw America itself as having a spiritual responsibility, not to dominate, but to serve as a beacon of spiritual awakening for the world. And he insisted that this mission could only be fulfilled if Americans lived according to the Christ pattern within. Imagine hearing that during the 1940s when the world was in flames. It wasn't just comfort, it was a call to responsibility. Cayce's teaching remains the same today. The Christ consciousness is not waiting to be discovered in the sky. It is waiting for you to awaken it in your own heart. When Edgar Cayce spoke about how to awaken the Christ consciousness, he always returned to the same foundation. It is a process of practice, not an instant revelation. He made clear that awakening begins with daily alignment. Prayer, he explained, is how we speak to God, but meditation is how we listen. In one of his wartime sessions, he described meditation as tuning a radio. The divine signal is always present, but we must quiet the noise of fear and distraction to hear it clearly. People who applied this practice reported remarkable experiences. Some described inner peace where there had been anxiety. Others claimed they received direct guidance about choices they had been struggling with. Cayce always emphasized that this was not about chasing visions or supernatural signs, but about developing a steady relationship with the Christ within. That relationship, he said, transforms the way we live, because it shifts the center of power from the ego to the soul. Imagine being told this in Virginia Beach during the 1940s, when the nation was consumed with fear of global war. For those who listened, these words offered not just hope, but a roadmap for survival through faith. But Cayce also insisted that awakening is not possible without forgiveness. He explained that every grudge, every resentment, every unhealed wound acts like a stone covering the light of Christ in us. Forgiveness, he said, is the act of clearing the path so the light can shine again. And this was not just theory. During a session that changed a woman's life, Cayce told her that her persistent illness was being aggravated by the anger she carried toward a family member. He urged her to release that bitterness, and in doing so she reported both emotional and physical improvement. This became one of Cayce's consistent themes. Forgiveness is not for the other person's sake, but for our own awakening. By forgiving, we dismantle the inner walls that separate us from God. And this was revolutionary because it reframed forgiveness from a moral duty to a spiritual technology. It wasn't about ignoring wrongs. It was about choosing to let the Christ within be stronger than the pain inflicted on us. Another crucial step Cayce taught was service. He said the Christ consciousness awakens most fully when we serve others without expecting reward. He reminded people that Jesus himself washed the feet of his disciples, demonstrating that true greatness is expressed through humility. In countless readings, Cayce told seekers that their healing and guidance would come when they shifted from self-centered desires to acts of love and service. He explained that service could be as simple as comforting a neighbor, feeding someone in need, or offering a kind word at the right time. Every act of service, he said, is an echo of Christ consciousness made visible. This principle gave ordinary people a way to embody divine awareness in their daily routines. It made awakening accessible to everyone, not just mystics or clergy. And for those struggling during the Depression or wartime, this teaching gave them a sense of purpose and dignity, even in the face of hardship. And yet Cayce also confronted the biggest challenge directly: fear. He declared that fear is the greatest enemy of the Christ consciousness, because it blinds us to the truth of our divine nature. He urged people to replace fear with faith, reminding them that every soul is a child of God. In one memorable session, he told a man paralyzed by fear of failure that his true success would come not through striving, but through surrender to the Christ within. That man later described a transformation in his life, where the very opportunities he feared losing began to open before him once he stopped resisting and started trusting. Cayce's message was consistent. Fear constricts, love expands. And awakening the Christ consciousness is the process of expanding so fully in love that fear can no longer control us. This is not just spiritual poetry, it is practical truth, as anyone who has faced fear with faith can attest. Cayce's teaching was not about avoiding struggle, but about transforming how we meet it. Cayce often said that awakening the Christ consciousness is like uncovering a light that has always been there, hidden beneath layers of doubt, selfishness, and worldly distraction. He emphasized that no soul is born without this seed of divinity, but most people live their entire lives without realizing it. In one session that deeply moved an entire family, Cayce described the Christ within as a pattern or blueprint placed in the soul from the very beginning of creation. He explained that the struggles of life, the hardships we endure, and even the mistakes we make are all opportunities to rediscover and live according to this pattern. And here is where Cayce diverged sharply from mainstream religion of his day. He did not say that awakening was reserved for a chosen few. Instead, he declared that this was the true destiny of every soul. Think of the impact. A farmer in Kentucky, a mother in New York, or a soldier overseas, all carried within them the same divine spark that Jesus embodied. Awakening it, Cayce said, was the real meaning of salvation. But what happened next surprised even those who trusted him most. Cayce explained that awakening the Christ consciousness is not about escaping the material world, but about transforming it. He said that spirituality and daily life cannot be separated. If you pray in the morning but treat others with bitterness during the day, you are blocking the very awareness you are seeking. Awakening requires consistency, living every moment as though Christ were within you, because he is. Cayce told seekers to watch not only their actions, but their thoughts, because every thought carries creative power. Loving thoughts build a bridge to the divine, destructive thoughts reinforce separation. He reminded people that Jesus did not retreat from the world, he engaged it fully, bringing divine awareness into ordinary human interactions. And Cayce urged everyone to do the same. This made his teaching radical but also practical, because it gave ordinary people a way to live their spirituality right in the middle of their daily struggles. Cayce also connected the Christ consciousness to healing in a way that continues to inspire today. He often said that true healing comes when the mind, body, and spirit are aligned with divine law. In documented sessions, he told people with chronic illnesses that their bodies could improve if they awakened to the love and peace of the Christ within. He explained that disease often begins in the mind and spirit, and when those are corrected, the body has greater power to heal. For some, this guidance led to remarkable recoveries. In one case, a woman battling an illness for years reported improvement after following Cayce's advice of daily meditation on Christ's presence within her. These stories spread quickly, convincing even skeptics that there was something real behind Cayce's words. He wasn't just speaking in metaphors, he was pointing to a living power that could change lives in measurable ways. And for families struggling with fear of sickness during the Depression and wartime, this message offered hope like nothing else. Another point Cayce made repeatedly was that awakening the Christ consciousness cannot happen in isolation. He insisted that community plays an essential role. In Virginia Beach, he often encouraged groups to meet together, meditate, pray, and study not just scripture, but their own inner experiences. He explained that when people gather with the intention of awakening Christ within, the combined energy amplifies the effect for each individual. He described it as tuning multiple instruments to the same note. Together they create harmony that no single instrument can achieve alone. This teaching influenced the formation of study groups across the country, many of which still exist today. For Americans living in times of loneliness and uncertainty, these groups became lifelines, where people discovered not only friendship, but a shared commitment to living out the Christ pattern. Cayce's vision was that these communities could eventually ripple outward, transforming neighborhoods, cities, and nations. He saw the Christ consciousness not just as a personal awakening, but as the key to global renewal. Cayce also made it clear that awakening the Christ consciousness is a lifelong journey, not a single mystical event. He explained that every day presents a choice, whether to live from the ego or from the divine within. In one reading that stayed with many, he said, "The Christ is in your midst whenever you choose love over fear." Simple words, but they carried immense weight. He compared the process to building a temple, stone by stone. Each act of kindness, each moment of forgiveness, each prayer of surrender is another stone placed in the foundation of the soul. And, over time, that temple becomes the living expression of Christ consciousness. This is why he urged people not to seek instant miracles or dramatic experiences, but to stay faithful in the small disciplines. Awakening, he said, is gradual, but it is unstoppable once the heart is set on love. He encouraged people not to judge their progress by external results, but by the growing peace within. That peace, he promised, is the sure sign that Christ has awakened in the soul. And yet Cayce did not hide the struggles that come with awakening. He admitted that those who commit to this path may face trials because the ego resists losing control. Fear, doubt, and old habits rise up to challenge the new awareness. But he reminded people that even Jesus faced temptation and that these battles are not failures. They are the proving ground of the soul. He reassured seekers that every setback can be turned into growth if met with humility and prayer. In this way, he reframed struggle as an essential part of awakening. Instead of being discouraged, he told people to see difficulties as opportunities to choose love again and again. Over time, these repeated choices strengthen the soul, until the Christ within shines more brightly than the shadows of fear. For those listening in the 1940s, this was a powerful encouragement. Their hardships were not signs of abandonment, but invitations to grow closer to God. Perhaps the most controversial part of Cayce's teaching was his insistence that the Christ consciousness is universal, not confined to one religion. He said plainly that this awareness belongs to every soul, no matter their tradition. Jesus, in his words, was the perfect embodiment, but the pattern exists in all. This challenged centuries of exclusivity, but it also opened the door to a broader vision of unity. Cayce foresaw a time when humanity would finally recognize this truth, and when it did, division and hatred would fade. He believed that wars and conflicts come from forgetting that every person carries the same divine spark. Awakening the Christ consciousness, therefore, is not only personal, it is the medicine the world desperately needs. And this is why he spoke with urgency, saying that the future of civilization depended on enough people choosing to live by the Christ pattern. His voice was a warning, but also a promise that awakening is possible if humanity is willing. One of the most practical ways Cayce advised people to awaken was through what he called the practice of the presence. He encouraged seekers to carry an awareness of Christ in every activity, from work to family to rest. It was not about withdrawing from life, but about infusing life with divine awareness. He told people that every meeting, every conversation, every decision could be an opportunity to express Christ. This was radical in its simplicity, because it meant no one had to wait for a church service or a special occasion. Awakening could happen in the kitchen, in the field, in the marketplace, anywhere the choice was made to love, and this democratized spirituality, giving dignity to the ordinary and sacredness to the everyday. For many Americans of his time, this teaching was liberating. It meant that God was not far away but present in every moment, waiting to be recognized. And once recognized, everything in life began to change. Cayce also tied the awakening of Christ consciousness to humanity's collective destiny. He often warned that if individuals failed to recognize the divine within themselves and others, the world would face consequences of division, greed, and conflict. But if enough souls awakened, humanity could enter a new era of peace and cooperation. He described this as a spiritual law. Consciousness shapes reality. Just as a single act of kindness can shift the atmosphere in a family, a critical mass of awakened souls could shift the destiny of nations. During the Second World War, he urged people not only to pray for victory, but to pray for the awakening of Christ within the world's leaders. He said that only when leaders govern from divine awareness can true peace be established. This teaching struck listeners as both idealistic and deeply practical. It was idealistic because it demanded transformation at the highest level, but practical because it began with the individual choice of each person. By living as if Christ were within, Cayce insisted, we contribute to a wave of change far larger than ourselves. But what happened next showed how deeply people believed in his message. Groups across America began forming study circles, inspired by Cayce's encouragement, where men and women gathered to meditate, read scripture, and share their efforts to awaken Christ within. These groups often reported powerful experiences, conflicts dissolving, healings occurring, and an overwhelming sense of unity that transcended differences of background or denomination. For many, this was the first taste of what Cayce had described, the realization that the Christ consciousness is not a theory but a living presence that manifests when people align together. These communities became seeds of transformation, and some still exist today, carrying forward Cayce's vision into the 21st century. They stand as proof that awakening is not confined to one person's mystical experience, but can become a shared reality. Cayce was also realistic about the challenges of sustaining this awakening. He explained that society is full of distractions, materialism, competition, fear, that constantly pull people away from divine awareness. He urged seekers to guard their minds and hearts, to choose carefully what they focused on, because attention is the channel of creation. He told them to replace destructive thoughts with constructive ones, to fill their minds with scripture, prayer, and uplifting ideas. He often said, "Mind is the builder." By this he meant that what we think consistently shapes not only our own destiny, but the world around us. Awakening the Christ consciousness, then, is not a passive hope, but an active discipline of thought, word and deed. It is training the soul to reflect God in every detail of life. This discipline may sound demanding, but Cayce reassured his listeners that it brings joy, freedom, and peace greater than anything the world can offer. In the end, Cayce's teaching about awakening the Christ consciousness was not a theory to debate, but a challenge to live. He pointed to Jesus as the perfect model, not so that we would worship him from a distance, but so that we would follow his example up close. Cayce's words remain as urgent now as they were in the 1930s and 40s. The Christ consciousness is within you, waiting to be awakened. Your thoughts, your actions, your forgiveness, your service, all are part of this awakening. And the future of humanity itself depends on how many of us choose to live by this pattern. So the question is not whether Christ consciousness is real. It is. The question is whether you will awaken it in your own life. If this message has touched you, take a moment now to share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to this channel, and join a community committed to living these truths. Because as Cayce reminded us, it is not what we know but what we live that matters. And in living the Christ consciousness, we not only transform ourselves, we help transform the world.